5. Stupid and the girl. My heart goes out to all the families who face this type of crisis. Atlanta Mayor Shirley Franklin. It was 5 a.m., California time, dark and quiet in the valley. Scott King, a business associate of Terry's, was asleep. At least he had been asleep. For some godforsaken reason, his phone was ringing. The phone was a prepaid cell, the kind you buy when you don't want anyone listening in on your calls. Scott was on the run, and he had to be careful. The guy on the line, Scott's close friend and business partner down in Atlanta, had to be careful too. Tremaine Kiki Graham was in nearly as much trouble as Scott was. For that reason, Kiki was also using a prepaid cell. Scott should have seen this coming. He'd been given plenty of signs. Still, the phone call shook him. Things were bad for him and Kiki. But what Kiki was whispering to him, news that boiled down to 6 deflating words, would make their situation a whole lot worse. Not that Kiki saw it that way. To him, this was his ticket to freedom. This would be his way out of the mess he'd stumbled into. At least that's what he was saying to those he trusted could keep their mouths shut. Scott knew better. He sensed that their run soon would come to an end. Months earlier, he'd sought refuge in L.A. from the heat he was drawing down south. Back home, he was a wanted man. And considering what Kiki had just told him, now they want him even more. Those 6 words that put an end to his slumber, cutting like a scythe through the L.A. pre-dawn, were sure to come back and haunt him. They were haunting him already. Scott and Kiki had been friends for a decade. In the late 80s, Scott attended North Carolina's Mars Hill College on a full basketball ride. 5 years later, when Kiki was accepted to nearby Clemson University, he also fell in with the basketball crowd. Kiki roomed with 2 of Clemson's players, Devin Gray and Andre Bovain. Devin and Andre were friends with Scott, so Kiki became friends with him too. Though Kiki didn't play for Clemson, he looked the part. Like Scott, he stood 6'5", a born charmer with an elegant build and easy smile. Scott and Kiki had a grace about them, one that earned them popularity not just on campus, but later among some of the country's most celebrated sports stars. The 2 men were personal acquaintances of NBA stars Charles Barkley and Michael Jordan. Scott and Kiki had something else in common too. While in college, they both began running cocaine on the side. For Scott, it started as a summer thing, but after dropping out of Mars Hill in his 4th year, he turned to the drug business full-time. One of Scott's primary customers lived in Greenville, South Carolina, the biggest city between Clemson and Mars Hill. Kiki worked as a courier for that drug customer. 4 years after he ditched school, Scott's lifestyle caught up with him. He was busted in California in '95 after picking up 12 kilos from his supplier. As a result, he would serve 3 years in state pen. He didn't turn on his crew, though. He kept his mouth shut about his customers back in the South Carolina, a display of loyalty that won him points with Kiki. Scott was released from prison in 1998 and moved to Atlanta, where Kiki happened to have relocated. They ran into each other one night while partying at the same club. Scott noticed that Kiki was doing pretty good for himself, and Kiki didn't hesitate to tell him why. He was still in the drug game, and it was treating him well. Not long after, Kiki stopped by Scott's apartment, a parole office-approved complex in Atlanta's historic West End. He pulled up in his new Range Rover, and he came bearing a generous gift. As a token of his appreciation for Scott's discretion following the drug bust, Kiki handed him $10,000, a little spending money for a man who recently reclaimed his freedom. It was only natural that the relationship progressed from there, especially after Kiki's cocaine supplier ripped him off. Scott offered to hook him up with some kilos through one of his old connects back in California, as well as with some other cocaine contacts he'd made. Within months, the 2 old friends decided it made sense to go into business together. Scott and Kiki would split the cost of each drug package and split the profits. Scott still had some hungry customers up in Greenville, after all, as well as a driver, a close college friend named Ulysses Hackett, who was willing to make the 2-hour delivery from Atlanta to the South Carolina city. Rounding out the arrangement, Kiki offered to turn a property he was still leasing from Greenville's Singing Pines Drive into a stash house for their South Carolina-bound shipments. The drug ring hummed along for a year or so, until in 1999, the 2 partners needed a bigger supplier. This time, it was Kiki who found him, a major cocaine trafficker named Jerry J. Rock Davis. J. Rock's girlfriend, who lived in the same Atlanta apartment building as Kiki's girlfriend, had introduced him. Though only a year older than Kiki, J. Rock was well ahead of him in the drug game. He'd been born in Columbus, Georgia, and his family later moved to a seedy suburb, Phoenix City, Alabama, just across the Chattahoochee River. The small town was infamous for its lawless past, so much so they had been dubbed Sin City by the soldiers stationed at Fort Benning on the other side of the Chattahoochee. In the 1940s and 1950s, Phoenix City was in the tight grip of a crime syndicate run by good old boys turned bad. Under their reign, the town had morphed into a Western-styled outpost of freewheeling drug dealing, open-air prostitution, blatant gambling, and rampant violence. Among the syndicate's victims was Attorney General-elect Albert Patterson, who'd run in 1954 on the promise of rooting out the city's organized crime network, which included countless cops and politicians. One day, not long before Patterson's inauguration, he was assassinated in front of his downtown law office. By the 90s, the city had tried to overcome its unsavory history. But even among a population of mere 30,000, Phoenix City remained fertile ground for the region's drug trade. J. Rock, who birthed a crew called the Sin City Mafia, was resurrecting Phoenix City's ignoble past. The feds estimated that the Sin City Mafia eventually would traffic as much cocaine as the Black Mafia family, an organization with whom J. Rock built a lucrative alliance. The two crews each moved truckloads of cocaine, and authorities surmised that they relied on the same LA supplier. After moving his organization's hub from Phoenix City to Atlanta and LA, J. Rock, like Meech and Terry, maintained stash houses that held hundreds of kilos at a time. As with BMF, Sin City's customers bought well upwards of 10 kilos, or keys, in a single transaction, and the packages were delivered in cars outfitted with secret compartments. J. Rock, like Meech and Terry, was a formidable kingpin. Short, stocky, and boyishly handsome, his appearance did little to reveal his sinister reputation. On the one hand, J. Rock was a family man. He looked after his mother and his grandmother, as well as his own growing clan. He would father 8 children by the time he was 31. He was good to his drug crew as well, offering similar compensation to what BMF doled out. And though he was generally more feared than BMF bosses, defections did occur from their camp to his, and vice versa. Most notably, a high-ranking BMF distributor, Richard "Ba" Garrett, jumped to the other side to become J. Rock's right-hand man. Ba appeared to be a more benign manager than his boss was. Once, when a courier delivering drugs for Ba and his shipment intercepted by authorities, J. Rock stepped in and told the underling that had the package belonged to him, the courier would be dead. Scott, for one, considered J. Rock's style a little too mafia. Scott wasn't crazy about bowing down to the Don, and the two never really saw eye to eye. Kiki was closer to J. Rock than Scott was. Overall, though, J. Rock's crew got along well, professionally and personally. Sometimes they even took trips together, purely for pleasure. Such was the case in February 2001 when Kiki, Scott, and 5 of J. Rock's associates, one of his partners, the partner's bodyguard, and 3 mid-level dealers, flew to Washington, D.C. for the NBA All-Star Game. By then, Kiki and Scott had been doing business with J. Rock for over a year, and they were fully ingratiated. For the trip, J. Rock's crew was furnished with a limousine and driver from an Atlanta company to which the boss had ties. Unlike any limo they might hire in D.C., this one would let them smoke weed in the car and carry guns. The night before the game, the crew was out on the town. They hit up a downtown strip club before calling on the white stretch Mercedes to come pick them up and take them to a party. After the men piled in, the limo began crawling up Connecticut Avenue, near DuPont Circle. The streets were jammed with cars and people, including a group of men who'd just left the Connecticut Avenue strip club, Royal Palace. 2 of the men darted across the street. To avoid hitting them, the limo slammed on its brakes, throwing the men in the back against their seats. The driver yelled out the window to the 2 pedestrians. They shouted something in response. The bodyguard who was traveling with J-Rock's crew, whom everyone called Dream, asked the driver if everything was cool. "Yeah," the driver said, "I can handle it." Dream wasn't convinced. He asked the driver if it was okay for him to try to defuse the situation with the pedestrians. The driver told him to go ahead. Dream stepped out of the limo and walked toward the front of the car. The sight of the oversized bodyguard did not deter the men in the street. The men, who were Hispanic, got into a racially charged shouting match with Dream and his entourage, who were piling out of the limousine. The men in the street started banging on the limo. One of them broke a bottle. As a retort, someone in Dream's entourage, accounts differ as to who, pulled a gun and began shooting wildly. A 25-year-old Salvadoran carpenter named Raul Rosales was shot in the mouth. He was pronounced dead at Howard University Hospital. Two of Rosales' friends were also hit, but they survived. In the melee, Dream also took a bullet to the back. He survived too. 3 people in the crowd identified the shooter as Michael Playboy Harris, who was an associate of J-Rock. But Scott was sure that it wasn't Playboy who did the shooting. Rather, he claimed he clearly saw one of his fellow drug dealers, a man named Jamad Soup Ali, pull the trigger. While Dream hobbled up Connecticut Avenue, the others hopped back into the limo. Not Scott, though. He'd had enough. He disappeared into the crowd. The limo driver spotted Dream a few minutes later and pulled over to pick him up. Dream climbed into the back seat, bleeding profusely from the bullet wound to his back. At that moment, Kiki realized Scott wasn't in the limo, and he was worried. He dialed Scott's number to make sure he hadn't been hit. Scott picked up and told Kiki he thought it would be smarter just to ditch the car and come meet him. "Every police agency in the world is here," Scott warned. "They're going to stop that limo." He was right. The limo was pulled over and everyone inside was questioned. Before that happened, though, Kiki had followed Scott's advice. He bolted from the back seat and hit the sidewalk running. He and Scott stayed on the phone, weaving through the tangle of D.C. streets before meeting up on a busy corner. From there, they hailed a cab and headed to the party, later than expected but not deterred. They were almost there when Scott noticed that Kiki's tie was splattered with blood. He pointed out the stains, and Kiki unknotted the thing and, after stepping out of the cab, tossed it in the trash. The 2 men then made their way inside. They weren't at the party long before their phones started lighting up. Word traveled fast, and friends and associates, including J-Rock, wanted to make sure they hadn't been hurt. Of course, J-Rock also expected a full account of what had gone on. After the party, Scott and Kiki headed back to their hotel. They didn't meet up with the other occupants of the limo until the following day. When they finally reunited, the men told Scott and Kiki that they'd been questioned, that Playboy had been arrested on multiple charges, including murder, and that Dream was laid up in the hospital. At that point, Scott and Kiki decided to distance themselves as much as they could from the rest of the crew. They even switched hotels. They had to be careful, and not just because law enforcement was watching. Their girlfriends were flying in that day to meet them. They had to regain some semblance of normalcy. Kiki was no longer dating the woman who'd introduced him to J-Rock. He had a new girlfriend, one he met through Scott. Scott, who was dating her younger sister, introduced them one night, when all 4 of them were hanging out in an Atlanta strip club. Kiki and the older sister hit it off. Kai Franklin was vivacious and attractive, curvy and petite. A full foot shorter than Kiki, even in heels. In that way, she took after her mother. Despite her diminutive stature, Kai's mother, Shirley Franklin, was a powerful woman in Atlanta politics. Her ex-husband, David, was an influential political advisor. She herself had served in 2 mayoral administrations. Franklin was the chief administrative officer and city manager under Mayor Andrew Young. She went on to become the Cultural Affairs Commissioner under Maynard Jackson, who, as Young's predecessor, had returned to the mayor's office for a 3rd term after Young's 2 terms ended. At one time, Jackson also was David Franklin's law partner. Shirley Franklin wasn't so tightly bound to Mayor Bill Campbell, who would end up the target of a federal racketeering indictment and was ultimately convicted only of tax evasion. But she was undoubtedly a crucial component of the Jackson-Young-Campbell machine that dominated the Atlanta political scene, which was why when Campbell's 2-term limit was nearing its conclusion, the machine was urging her to take aim at the mayor's seat. To have Shirley Franklin running for mayor is just so delicious because it's the first true draft I've ever seen. Her ex-husband told the press shortly after he launched her campaign. The 2 had remained close friends. Yet the rest of her family was surprised that her name was being batted around. She was a private person. She reveled in behind-the-scenes policy and strategy. She'd never been the type to seek the spotlight. Still, she was highly qualified and immensely likable. Most important, she could win, and the machine was persuasive. Despite having never run for public office and never before having seemed interested in such a thing, Shirley Franklin was game. As Atlanta's 2001 mayoral campaign was heating up, it became clear to Kiki that he needed to legitimize his earnings. That's because he intended to make Shirley Franklin's eldest daughter his wife. In his foray into legitimacy, as with his illegal endeavors, Kiki formed a partnership with Scott King. The two men decided to open a car dealership and customization shop on the outskirts of Buckhead, one that would offer $2,000 rims and $350,000 Bentleys. Kiki and Scott incorporated their business in September 2001, and they called it 404 Motorsports, so named for Atlanta's in-town area code. The dealership had a club-like setting, and it catered to the type of customers who might qualify for an Amex Black Card. The walls of 404 Motorsports were graced with autographed jerseys of clients such as Atlanta Brave Andrew Jones and Cleveland Brown Corey Fuller. Graham's business would be a portal to celebrities with whom he had an easy rapport, and his fiancée would be a liaison to Atlanta's political elite. That year, both Scott and Kiki sat down for Christmas dinner with the Franklin family. There was so much to celebrate. Shirley's recent victory in her upcoming inauguration. She'd taken the race by a 17 percentage point lead. Scott and Kiki's new business, and right around the corner, wedding bells. Kai and Kiki were married December 29, 2001. Kiki now had all the more reason to keep up appearances. Fortunately for him, he possessed an uncanny ability to come across as legit. There was a pleasantness about Kiki, an understated ambition that made people believe in him, to convince themselves he was someone he wasn't. He dressed in three-piece suits and smart ties. He hobnobbed with superstars, and his wife was the daughter of a wildly popular mayor, the first African-American woman to hold that post in any major southern city. If he was careful enough, Kiki would be guaranteed a charmed life. He and Scott ran into a snag, though. As 2002 wore into 2003, their business wasn't making money. Even with the two men continuing to move cocaine, they couldn't keep 404 Motorsports afloat without outside help. For that, they turned to Kiki's father-in-law, David Franklin. For over a decade, David had run a successful and, some say, controversial concessions business at Atlanta's Hartsfield International Airport. With his business partner Ed Wilson, Franklin headed Franklin & Wilson Concessions, which operated 3 stores on 2 airport concourses. 2 of them were called Bijou Turner and specialized in luxury travel items. The other was called Bagmania. David Franklin had to obtain lucrative, city-approved contracts to do business at Hartsfield, contracts that Shirley Franklin didn't approve and didn't benefit from. The city's ethics board later would rule. But 2 of her 3 children did benefit. Her 28-year-old son, Cabral, served as vice president of budget and planning of Franklin & Wilson, as well as a financial analyst and board member. And her daughter, Kai, a year older than Cabral, was director of national brands. Sometime after she got married, though, Kai and her husband ran into money trouble. The problem was that, on paper at least, the couple wasn't making enough money to support their lifestyle, which included a $600,000 home in the snooty Atlanta suburb East Cobb and Kai's expensive furs and jewels. In order to become more convincing, Scott and Kiki were hoping that 404 Motorsports could somehow show more income. An income from a company as entrenched as David Franklin's would be all the better. According to Scott, he and Kiki invested $150,000 in Franklin & Wilson Concessions, with the expectation that David would write a check every month to 404 Motorsports, which would help create more IRS-friendly revenue. But, as Scott recalled, David Franklin didn't write any checks to 404. According to Scott, David Franklin instead made out the check to his daughter Kai, even after she quit working for him. Unfortunately, Kai drawing an income, even one she shared with her husband, wasn't equivalent to 404 Motorsports doing so. As a result, Scott would claim the investment turned out not to be what the company needed. Another business deal, one that Kiki arranged, had more substantial benefits for the company. A powerful drug associate of J-Rock's wanted to sink $250,000 of his own cash into Kiki and Scott's car shop. Kiki was thrilled. Early in 2003, he stopped by the White House to pick up the money from his new investor, Terry Flannery, whose top-level associate, AR, loaded the bundles of cash into secret compartments in Kiki's car. The contribution was enough to qualify Terry as a silent owner. And though the money did nothing to help 404 Motorsports show legitimate income, it did offer a quick infusion for the bleeding business. The remission was short-lived. By April of 2003, Terry wasn't seeing enough of a return on his investment, and he expected some payback. Kiki couldn't give him money, so to stave him off, he offered up a pair of $100,000 Porsches. Kiki put the cars in his wife's name, who signed off on the paperwork and financing, and then presented them to Terry. Kai never even saw them. Kiki and Scott's veneer of legitimacy was wearing thin, and as they were struggling to maintain the illusion, their boss, J-Rock, was busy creating one of his own. Like his friend Meech, J-Rock was hoping to make inroads in the music biz. At around the same time that 404 Motorsports was incorporated, J-Rock began building a studio, Platinum Recording, on Atlanta's West Side, an area that already was home to the renowned Dallas-Austin Recording Projects, DARP, and Patchwork Recording Studios. Platinum was comparable to those ventures in cost and equipment, if not prestige. It boasted a $360,000 soundboard, a $315,000 tour bus, and an in-house label, Depp Woods Records, named after a rap group J-Rock had signed. J-Rock even hired Meech and Terry's dad, Charles, who had experience putting together more humble recording studios, to do the renovations out of the state-of-the-art space. Unlike the other studios in the neighborhood, however, Platinum was not pulling in any significant business. In its early days, at least, Platinum never earned more than $2,000 in a given recording session, a paltry sum compared with the tens of thousands of dollars that competing studios collected per day. In fact, it was J-Rock's drug business, and not any paying clients, that covered the studio's expenses. J-Rock pulled in far more money than Scott and Kiki, and so he did a better job supporting his studio than they did their car dealership. J-Rock sank $30,000 a month into Platinum Recordings between the studio's equipment, bills, and salaried employees, one of whom was paid to make sure members of Depp Woods made it to their shows and stayed out of trouble. Another Platinum employee, hired to do accounting work, began to suspect that the studio was a front, but continued to work there for fear that J-Rock wouldn't accept a resignation without retribution. Looking to expand his roster, J-Rock assumed the role of manager in 2002 to an aspiring teenage rapper out of North Carolina. Born Walter Tucker, Ooh-Wee was a promising addition to J-Rock's label, which he renamed Bogart Records in early 2003. Ooh-Wee was tight with BMF. Meech had made a habit of befriending young rappers, even those who had other representation and pending record deals, and he was particularly fond of the tough but pretty lyricist, fond enough to feature him prominently in blues videos still here. As for Meech and J-Rock, they were cool, both in matters lawful and otherwise. J-Rock had one crew and Meech had another, but the two bosses looked out for each other. In fact, in many ways, Meech and BMF Entertainment took after J-Rock and Bogart. Both bosses had a genuine passion for the industry, and the industry in turn valued their street smarts. Meech and J-Rock also possessed the bravado, if not the acumen, of more traditional music moguls. But there were some notable differences between the two bosses. For starters, J-Rock was a silent partner in his label and recording studio, presenting himself as a freelance artist rep rather than the money and leadership behind the venture. He went so far in his charade as to meet Bogart's accountant in random parking lots, usually behind the wheel of a Ferrari or Lamborghini, clandestinely hand off any cash the studio might need. Meech, on the other hand, put himself out there. He was a very public face of BMF Entertainment, which, even as record labels go, was a highly noticeable organization. The fact that BMF, like Bogart, was financed with drug money appeared not to dissuade Meech from flooding the market with excessive displays of exorbitant wealth, money that had no verifiable legal origin. J-Rock was more understated. Yet no matter how careful he was in separating himself from Bogart, J-Rock remained inextricable from the Sin City Mafia. J-Rock was Sin City Mafia. And once investigators started sniffing around J-Rock's crew, the boss had reason to worry, but only to a point. That's because J-Rock, like Meech, considered himself fairly impenetrable. He was near the top of his game, after all. Only further down the food chain, or so the logic goes, does one become vulnerable. Baron Johnson existed somewhere along the middle of that food chain. The Greenville coke dealer had a few street-level guys working for him, and he was buying about 10 kilos at a time from his supplier. Vice detectives at the local police department stumbled onto him in 2002, after orchestrating a few undercover street corner buys from West Greenville dealers, whom Baron was supplying. From there, the detectives landed a wiretap on one of Baron's phones. Based on what they heard, it appeared he was getting his drug shipments from Atlanta. One of his Atlanta suppliers, they learned, was a man named Scott King, and one of Scott's associates, Ulysses Hackett, was driving the coke up to Baron on a regular basis. After nailing down Scott and Baron's supplier, the local investigators went to the Greenville office of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration in the summer of 2003 to see if the federal agents might be interested in the case. The DEA was interested, as was the criminal division of the IRS. The two agencies immediately launched a full-scale investigation into Scott King's drug ring and assets. In December 2003, Baron Johnson, Scott King, and Ulysses Hackett were indicted under seal in federal court in Greenville. The indictment charged them with conspiracy to distribute cocaine and to launder drug money. Baron was quickly apprehended, and it didn't take long for investigators to convince him to talk. He went so far as to arrange a 4-kilo shipment from Scott, who knew nothing of Baron's arrest or his own pending charges. And so Scott sent Hack to Greenville with the package, as he'd done countless times before. Hack planned to meet Baron at the stash house on Singing Pines Drive, the one Kiki had leased, but he didn't make it that far. On the afternoon of January 21st, 2004, a highway patrol trooper acting on DEA orders pulled over Hack's SUV on I-85, a few miles shy of its destination. In the back seat, investigators found 4 neatly wrapped and barely disguised kilos of cocaine. The same day, a federal judge signed off on a search warrant for the house on Singing Pines Drive. During the search, investigators found another 10 keys inside the same stash house. The drugs, along with $80,000, were tucked away in 5 underground safes. Later that afternoon, Scott was hanging out at his townhouse when Hack's girlfriend, Misty Carter, knocked on his door. She'd heard about Hack's arrest, and she wanted to help. Misty was 24 years old, a graduate of Atlanta's historically black, all-female Spelman College, and a salesgirl at an upscale Atlanta boutique. Not that she needed work. As the daughter of a well-to-do physician in the idyllic town of Fayetteville, North Carolina, Misty was still pampered by her parents. She had little experience with the ins and outs of the drug game or the workings of the legal system, but she did have access to cash. She broke a savings bond in order to free Hack from jail, and Scott promised to pay her back. Immediately after she left, he called Kiki. The two made arrangements to pay for Hack's lawyer, a move they mistakenly believed would give them access to the sealed evidence filed in the case, which in turn would allow them to see how close the government might be to nabbing them too. Scott, however, didn't have to wait long to find out what the feds had in store for him. Days after Hack's arrest, the full indictment was unsealed, and Scott learned that he, though not Kiki, had been charged. Scott wasn't going to wait around for authorities to find him. Using a fake ID, he caught a flight to California, where he intended to start over. The move across country was an easy one. J-Rock had just relocated to LA too, along with his new wife. The couple had taken up residence in one of 3 houses where J-Rock stored his fresh to the U.S. drug shipments. The $2 million home was still in LA Hills, technically, but close to the belly of the valley, and even closer to Terry Flannery's primary stash house, The Jump. You could walk from one home to the other in less than 5 minutes. Like Terry, J-Rock had little choice but to maintain several LA properties to keep up with the drugs he purchased, allegedly from their supplier in common, the one with a direct Mexican connection. J-Rock's crew called the house where he lived first base. It was located in a neighborhood called Sherman Oaks, at the crest of a long climbing driveway. The three-story stucco and terracotta structure was exposed to the road, but so far away from it that, as with Terry's jump, any outside surveillance was all but impossible. J-Rock's second base was a nearby pad where his crew usually stayed in the same LA neighborhood, and third base was way out on Ventura Boulevard, in a part of LA so far west that even the locals, who had a looser definition of a sprawl than most of the rest of the world, considered it the distant reaches. That house, on a cheerful, tidy street called Oso Avenue, was home to the largest of J-Rock's drug shipments, several hundred kilos at a time. With all that property, there was plenty of room for Scott King, and also plenty of work. While living as a fugitive, Scott stayed deep in the game, and he maintained regular contact with Kiki, who seemed to be better situated with this whole mess. Baron Johnson didn't know Tremaine Kiki Graham. He'd never seen him, never spoke to him. And so, while Baron could and did contribute to Scott King's undoing, Kiki would prove a harder catch. The one thing that concerned Kiki was the possibility that Hack might turn government's witness. Hack did, in fact, meet with federal investigators. In the early spring of 2004, he agreed to provide a statement, and in that statement, he talked a lot about the fugitive Scott King. That's what the feds were expecting to hear, and what surprised him, though, was how little Hack was willing to say about Kiki. Even at that point, investigators had enough on Kiki to know that Hack was hiding something. Hack, they believed, was lying to protect him, and so one of Hack's interrogators, DEA agent Jay Rajay, let him know that he saw right through the act. "This is over," Rajay told him. "I'm not talking to you anymore." Hack told Kiki about the meeting, an admission that had the unintended consequence of further fueling Kiki's paranoia. Kiki was sure that Hack would cooperate against him, if he hadn't already, and he confided this to Scott. By then, the two friends had begun to refer to Hack as stupid because of the little white lies Hack was always telling. To Kiki, those white lies were beginning to assume a darker hue. Kiki was convinced Hack was out to get him, and the only way he could possibly be indicted would be if stupid were to fold. Yet despite his growing belief that he was, in fact, fallible, Kiki continued to traffic cocaine. He was more careful about it than ever. He came up with what he thought was a foolproof plan, and to put that plan into motion, he decided to join Scott and J-Rock in California for a while. He was a free man, after all, one who could travel anywhere he pleased, and if he were added to the federal indictment while he was out in L.A., well, maybe he'd make the move permanent. Before Kiki came up with his plan, J-Rock's primary method for transporting his drugs from California to Georgia and his drug money in the opposite direction was by private jet. Of course, you couldn't just send anyone on a $30,000 flight across the country with luggage that contained 300 kilos of uncut cocaine or $4 million in bundled bills. Such a job called for a professional. In early 2004, J-Rock had learned that a man named Eric Mookie Rivera was up to the task, and he quickly brought Mookie on board. As with past couriers, Mookie lived where J-Rock lived, which meant Atlanta at times, alternating with L.A. J-Rock typically would have his couriers make at least one clean cross-country trip. During that flight, neither drugs nor drug proceeds, the latter of which were typically packed in boxes and topped with wrap flyers, would be brought on board. The idea was to get a feel for things, but in 2004, Kiki arrived in California to meet with both J-Rock and Mookie, and based on what he proposed, the practice flight would not be necessary. With Kiki's help, J-Rock was about to change things up. Kiki's cocaine trafficking plan was so impressive that the boss offered to pay him $60,000 for every load of drugs he shipped. The Graham method, as one associate called it, relied on a friend of Kiki's, Ernest E. Watkins. It utilized the well-oiled delivery system of the United Parcel Service, and it was designed in such a way to protect everyone involved. That's because the only people who could possibly get caught transporting the drugs across country could claim complete ignorance if they happened to be busted. The first time they tried out the plan, Kiki met J-Rock at first base, where they snugly packed bricks of cocaine into large cardboard boxes. Once full, the boxes weighed in at about 70 pounds each. They were addressed to a fictitious address in Atlanta from a fictitious sender in L.A. One of J-Rock's associates then met them at a house, having been forewarned by Kiki to dress conservatively. The associate loaded the boxes into a van and drove them to a UPS store just up the street off Ventura. Once the shipment left the associate's hands, the rest of the trip was cake. The boxes were unceremoniously pushed, hoisted, and shoved, passing from van to plane, back to van again, along with countless other large brown boxes. They plodded across the country, indistinguishable from other packages, the difference being that the contents of these particular boxes couldn't be insured to their actual value. Even wholesale, the cocaine inside was worth well over $500,000. If street value was taken into account, each box would be worth millions. Once the boxes landed in Atlanta, Kiki's friend Ernest, who had an inside source at UPS, orchestrated the interception. The insider watched for the boxes bearing the fictitious Atlanta address. Sure enough, he found them. After setting the boxes aside, he then hand-delivered the precious cargo to Ernest. After seeing the boxes off in L.A., Kiki and Mookie flew to Atlanta a few days later to catch up with the shipment. Ernest met them at the airport with the good news. The plane had gone off without a hitch, and so Kiki and Mookie returned to L.A. to do it all over again and again. The two went back and forth several times in early 2004. During one of those trips, however, Kiki received news from back home. The news brought his involvement into the scheme to a screeching halt. His wife Kai called him. The feds were at his house in East Cobb. They had a warrant, and they were digging through everything. DEA agent Rajay, the one who'd interviewed Hack a few months earlier, had traveled to Atlanta from Greenville to participate in the search. Fellow DEA agent Jack Harvey, out of the Atlanta office, had drafted the warrant for Kiki's house, which was located on Hallmark Drive. Harvey was deep in the throes of an investigation into BMF, and several of his subjects had trickled over into Rajay's investigation, so the two agents joined forces. When they first arrived at the house, a handsome two-story brick traditional with a circular drive, it appeared that no one was home. The agents knocked on the door, sat back, and waited. Finally, Kai Franklin Graham, the mayor's daughter, answered. The agents gathered several items as they combed through the house, including a receipt for a storage shed issued to someone named Ernest Watkins. The name meant nothing to them at the time. That would change. As Kiki soon would learn, the search warrant coincided with his name being tacked on to Scott in Hack's indictment. Out in California, Kiki and Scott discussed what he should do, and more important, how they were going to climb out of their deepening hole. The next day, Kiki and Scott headed over to first base to continue the conversation. They needed guidance from J-Rock. As the three men sat and talked, Scott decided he would remain a fugitive. He might as well ride this one out, make the feds sweat him a little more. Kiki, on the other hand, was leaning toward surrendering. After all, he bragged, his mother-in-law was the mayor. He seemed to think she'd pull some strings, and he'd be out of jail in no time. 2 weeks after his indictment, Kiki showed up at the U.S. Attorney's office in Atlanta to turn himself in. A few days later, a federal magistrate set a $300,000 bond for Kiki, with the condition that he wear an ankle monitor and remain under house arrest. The bond had nothing to do with the fact that he was the mayor's son-in-law, though, and everything to do with his clean criminal history. Federal prosecutors didn't even push to keep Kiki locked up. His wife Kai, with the help of her younger sister, found a bonding company willing to spring her husband. In the application for the bond, she noted that she earned an $80,000 salary through her father's airport concessions company, her father being the well-connected ex-husband of the mayor. The woman behind the desk at the free last bail bonds was impressed with Kai and the fact that she was driving a Porsche convertible. The bondswoman didn't require Kai to secure the bond with any asset, such as her and Kiki's home. It was an unusual move, but it also was an unusual case. The defendant was the son-in-law of the mayor. Instead of putting up her house, Kai paid $30,000 out of pocket, and free at last, assumed the rest of the debt, with the understanding that in the unlikely event her husband was to flee, she'd be responsible for the $300,000, though her house wouldn't be on the line. While Kiki's bond had plenty to do with the standing of his wife, it had little to do with Mayor Shirley Franklin. The mayor pulled no strings for Kiki. All that talk back in California about how easy it would be for him to get out of jail amounted to a bunch of boasting in the company of friends. Despite having no direct connection to the mayor, Kiki's arrest pained her on personal levels. "I am saddened to hear of the indictment," Shirley Franklin told the Associated Press, stressing that she was speaking not as the mayor, but as a mother. "I am hopeful that he will be found innocent, but we must let the legal system run its course. My heart goes out to all the families who face this type of crisis. Those words would be little consolation to another family that was about to be dragged into this crisis in a far harsher way. Rather than use his time under confinement to step back from his situation and take pause, Kiki dived right back into the game. On the outside, he was quiet, repentant even. But beneath that doleful facade, Kiki was plotting. Amazingly, he continued to oversee the UPS scheme, this time from his home on Hallmark Drive, and presumably because he was hurting for money. He stayed in close contact with Ernest E. Watkins, who handled the shipments on the Atlanta end through his UPS insider, and with Eric Mookie Rivera, who'd flown back and forth from L.A. with him. Mookie had grown fond of Kiki. He had sympathy for his situation. The two talked often on the phone, Kiki using a prepaid cell, of course, more like friends than drug associates. Kiki complained to Mookie that J-Rock wasn't helping out with his legal expenses as much as Kiki had hoped, and Mookie thought that was highly unfair. Kiki and Mookie had helped J-Rock make tens of millions of dollars, yet those directly under J-Rock saw nowhere near that kind of money. Paying some attorney fees was the least J-Rock could do. Fueled by the injustice of it, Kiki hatched another scheme, this time behind J-Rock's back. Mookie wanted to help, so Kiki asked him to arrange a flight on a private jet from Atlanta to LA, and to get to Atlanta as soon as possible. It would be hard, Mookie said, because he was still under J-Rock's command in California, and J-Rock watches everyone and everything so closely. But somehow, he said, he'd swing it. One night in the summer of 2004, Mookie made good on his promise. He arrived at the house on Hallmark Drive and stayed the night with Kiki. Ernest, the guy with the UPS connection, joined them the following afternoon. The three men sat in the house, counting and packing stacks upon stacks of cash. With that task out of the way, the operation was solely in Mookie's and Ernest's hands. Mookie had arranged for a jet to meet them at a small private airport in Atlanta, and Ernest had called for a car to take them there, along with the suitcases filled with money. They flew the cash to L.A., where Mookie's work was done. Ernest then took the money, bought a decent-sized cocaine package, and shipped it to Atlanta using the UPS method. He'd done it plenty of times before, but this occasion would be different. This time, the drugs belonged to Kiki, not J-Rock. Kiki would see the bulk of the profit. J-Rock wouldn't even know about it. But Kiki did confide in J-Rock about other matters. Chief among them was Kiki's mounting distrust of Hack. Kiki couldn't shake the notion that Hack was a threat, and Kiki was beginning to suspect that Hack was the threat to J-Rock too. Over the years, Hack's dealings with J-Rock had been minimal and wasn't high up enough in the organization to interact with the boss. But once, when Scott and Kiki were out of town, they'd asked Hack to bring J-Rock some drug money they owed him. Hack handed over the cash to J-Rock himself. That was the extent of the connection between J-Rock and Hack, but it was enough to directly implicate J-Rock in the drug trade. And Kiki kept harping on it. He said that if J-Rock didn't want his name tacked onto the indictment, something had to give. To Katie Carter, Hack came across as a very nice young man. She first met him during a trip in Atlanta in 2003. He was clean-cut and clearly crazy about her daughter, Misty. It was easy to see why. Misty was a pretty girl. She had wide, sparkling eyes. A shiny black bob framed her oval-shaped face. And according to her daddy, Misty had $1 million smile. She was a little naive, but deeply kind, and when it came to her boyfriend, deeply in love. She was spoiled, too, and Katie Carter is quick to admit it. As an only child, Misty consumed all her parents' attention. When she graduated from Spelman, the Carters bought her a townhome on Atlanta's trendy Highland Avenue. They paid for her car, her clothes, and whatever else Misty could possibly need. To the Carters, it was worth it. She was a good daughter. When Katie first met her daughter's boyfriend, he picked them up at Misty's place and took them to breakfast, then to his place of work. Katie could tell that he was proud of the business, and she herself was impressed. 404 Motorsports was a high-end operation. Even with the mechanic working on a car in the back of the showroom, the entire place was spotless, Katie recalled, just like a freshly mopped kitchen floor. At first, Katie thought Hack was one of the dealership's owners, but she soon realized he only worked for them. Misty mentioned one of the owners, Scott, to her mother in passing. She boasted that he hobnobbed with the city's elite and played golf with genuine sports stars. Hack and his friends seemed to be good people, but a couple of things about him bothered Katie. One, Hack was so much older than Misty, a full 10 years. Katie Carter also began to notice how often Hack went in and out of town. "Misty, where's Hack going?" Katie asked her daughter over the phone one day. "Why is he always going to South Carolina? Did you ask him?" "Yes," Misty answered, exasperated. "I asked him." "What did he say?" "He said some things are better that you not know." Misty didn't tell her parents that her boyfriend had been arrested, but Katie would soon suspect her daughter was keeping something from them. Misty wouldn't have wanted her parents to know, of course, because they'd have insisted she come home to Fayetteville. Misty wanted to stay in Atlanta to support Hack. Weeks later, in the summer of 2004, the Carter family went to San Diego. Paul Carter, a vascular surgeon, had a medical conference to attend, and his wife and daughter wanted to tag along. Katie took the opportunity to press her daughter for more info on her boyfriend's frequent trips. "He doesn't say anything about it," Misty insisted. "Well, you need to know," her mother said. "He's probably going to see another woman. He could have a wife somewhere. You don't know. You just don't know." The questions didn't seem to bother Misty. Throughout the trip, in fact, she remained upbeat. And, as always, she was disappointed when she and her parents had to part ways. On their way home, Paul and Katie were on a separate flight from their daughter, though they did have a short layover in Atlanta before heading on to Raleigh. Misty's flight arrived in Atlanta not long before her parents, and she ran to their terminal to give them yet another goodbye. Over the next few weeks, Misty spent a lot of time on the phone, chatting with her mother. That was the norm. A few years earlier, Misty had insisted that Katie buy a cell phone. Misty had grown frustrated when, time after time, she would call her mother at her father's medical practice where Katie worked too, only to find her out on an errand. Misty was the type who wanted to check in with her mother about everything. The fact that she was going across the street for ice cream, the property she was interested in renting to open a men's spa, the Carters wanted to help their daughter start her own business, the furniture she was considering for her townhouse, and whatever else happened to cross her mind. One day in September 2004, Katie spoke with her daughter no fewer than 4 times. During the last call, Misty mentioned that she and Hack were staying in that evening. And so, unlike those nights when Misty went out with her girlfriends, Katie didn't worry. She didn't go through the ritual that mothers often endure, waking in the middle of the night to wonder if her only child was okay. She didn't sit up in the bed and glance at the clock. She didn't stare at the ceiling and ask herself whether she knew for sure that her daughter was safe. On that night, Misty was home. Though Kiki kept Scott apprised of just about everything going on with him, he didn't say much about the gun, only that it came in such a nice case. Ernest, a gun collector and enthusiast, had gotten it for him. Ernest, who'd been so integral to Kiki's UPS scheme. Anyway, Kiki didn't keep the gun for long. He told Scott he passed it along to J-Rock. He said J-Rock was going to take care of this. At first, Kiki had the audacity to ask Scott to handle it. Scott balked. Hack was like a brother to him. He'd known him for that long. No way, Scott told him. He didn't want any part of it. Eventually, Kiki backed off, and Scott was able to put it out of his mind until September 4th, 2004. Police would speculate that at least 3 people were involved in the incident that occurred in those early morning hours at an upscale townhouse off Highland Avenue. One of the men, investigators believed, waited in the car. It appeared that 2 others hopped the iron fence that separated the sidewalk from the building's manicured grounds. They hurried noiselessly across the damp grass, unseen in the hushed pre-dawn. They kicked in the door of one of the units and bounded up the stairs toward the master bedroom. They left nothing to chance. Hack and Misty both were shot in the head. As the killers rushed back to the getaway car, they most likely believed that they'd left behind a pristine crime scene. The gun wasn't theirs, and it would soon disappear. There were no fingerprints left behind, no shoe imprints, no fibers, no forensic evidence that could link them to the murder of Ulysses Hackett and Misty Carter. What they didn't take into account was that someone in the complex saw them run. The person got a good enough glimpse at one of the men, at least, to remember his face. The witness later would point to a picture and a photographic lineup and unequivocally state that the man in the photo was the one who sprinted from the townhouse after the shots rang out. The sun already had risen in Atlanta when Scott King was shaken from sleep and forced to face the California darkness. Kiki knew the hour was crazy, but he had to call right away. His explanation was succinct. He would get back to Scott later with the details. Another of those what to do next conversations that he and Scott often had. But in the meantime, he thought Scott ought to know. Stupid and the girl are dead.